everyone. And when Deborah saw the crowd, she says, this is going to be like an adda. So that's a good spin on the, okay. Welcome to a discussion on a fascinating book. The Last Englishman, Love, War, and End of Empire. Now, there's another big word with E. There are two big words with E in this book, empire, and the other big word which is missing from the title, which is Everest. And this book has so many strands. Let's use a geological analogy. It has so many layers. There's this group of Englishmen who want to climb Mount Everest. That's the last Englishman. That's one layer. Now, when do they want to do this? In the 1920s and 30s, when empire is on the wane. So there's a whole empire thing. And then you have the whole freedom struggle. So you have Gandhi in this book, Churchill in this book, the Bengal famine, and it's between the two wars. So then you have the two wars. Then you have the love lives of these fellows who want to climb Mount Everest. They have to love with the same woman, two of them. And then, so there are many of them, but we are going to focus on three. John Auden, the older brother of the great poet Wystan Auden. Michael Spender, the older brother of the poet Stephen Spender. And Sudhin Datta, a poet in Calcutta who runs this fascinating adda. Now, Deborah's done this marvelous thing of connecting this group of Englishmen who want to climb Mount Everest and Sudhin Datta in Calcutta. Deborah, why did you call your book The Last Englishman?
Well, I came across, when I was writing my book on Allen Ginsberg, I came across this wonderful quote from Jawaharlal Nehru. He said it to John Kenneth Galbraith, who was the American ambassador to India in 1962. He said, "I am the last Englishman to rule in India." And I thought that was an interesting idea, the way that Nehru saw himself. But I also felt that you know, this last generation of Englishmen who lived and worked in India, I think they had a hard time understanding who they would be without India.
Right.
As Englishmen.
So you call them the last English. Why do you call them the last Englishmen?
Because I don't think England really knew what kind of nation it would be without its empire.
Okay, so do you want to tell us a little bit about these three men? Just their personality, so then we can discuss the whole book, but so that the audience knows what
Sure.
each of these three men were like.
Well, Michael Spender actually was at school with W.H. Auden. They were both considered the scientists of the school. They were lab partners. They went to Oxford together. They both had science scholarships. And Michael was a really brilliant man. He was a brilliant musician. He played the organ. He was interested in engineering. I think he would have been really fantastic. He was interested in trains. He was interested in cameras, in wireless sets. He was really a man that was much more attuned to the workings of machines than the workings of other human beings. So his brother, Stephen Spender, felt constantly undermined by Michael, constantly competitive with Michael, but he also felt that Michael had something wrong with him because Stephen was much more attuned to his own inner life and the sort of workings, the machinery of his heart than Michael was. Michael seemed quite cold and brittle to Stephen. So that's one character. And Michael eventually learns about cartography, map making, and surveying. So that's the role he plays in the whole quest for Everest. Surveying was undergoing a lot of technological improvements, mostly spearheaded by a Swiss surveyor. So he was learning the technology of surveying in Switzerland and was then brought into the Himalayas to survey the mountains there. And John Auden, who went to Cambridge, did geology there, and in 1926 traveled to Calcutta, which was where the Geological Survey of India was based, and began working as a geologist. And basically the the mission of the Geological Survey of India at that point was both to do a geological map of all of India, but mostly to identify where the rare minerals, coal, was. And so he was first sent off to Raniganj, which is, where all the major coal deposits in India are. And in his free time, he would go to the Himalayas and climb mountains and do geological surveys of the Himalayas. And the last, the last man who sort of enters into the book is a man named Surendranath Datta. His father was a contemporary of Rabindranath Tagore, and like the Tagores, the Dattas made their money in business ventures with the English and as solicitors. So, and in the 20s, Sudin went on one of Tagore's world tours, and sort of that was his first exposure to Europe. He was very well learned in European languages. He spoke German, he read French, he was a devotee of Mallarmé. He was an aspiring poet himself. He didn't want to do law the way his father had done, and so that was, and then he returned to Calcutta and started this magazine called Pariche, and this Adda called Pariche Adda.
So we have these three characters, and now we have Mount Everest. So now Everest has been around forever, and why were the English so sort of obsessed with wanting to climb it? I don't know if any Indian groups had tried before this, or let me give you the Vijay Lakshmi Pandit anecdote, which was in a review of Deborah's book. When Vijay Lakshmi Pandit was, I think this happened in the 1950s when she was ambassador, I don't know, 50s or 60s. There was this young group of Englishmen staying at her house. She woke up one morning at 9 o'clock and she saw them all lounging around in her living room. And she looked at them and she said, the old empire building Englishmen, they would have climbed Mount Everest and come back before I had breakfast ready. There was a big thing for them to climb Mount Everest. Why was it so important, Deborah?
I think their reasoning sort of changed over the years. In the 20s, I felt that a lot of the mountaineers that were brought to India to climb Mount Everest, a lot of them were veterans of the trenches. And I think the feeling that in the 20s was that if England could reach the top of Everest, that would be a great, with this perfect Englishman, that would be a great memorial to all the Englishmen that had been lost in the trenches.
Okay.
By the 30s, I think Everest and a lot of these 8,000-meter mountains began to become more politicized. And like the proxy wars underway in Spain and in Abyssinia, these mountains became a way of these European nations to sort of perform their superiority. And, Germany claimed, a mountain, France claimed a mountain, and of course the English claimed Everest. And their feeling was that if they could climb Everest, that would somehow quiet all the unrest that was being stirred up by Nehru and Gandhi. That Indians would be so impressed by this feat of, British masculinity and superiority that they would, give up their struggle for nationhood.
They would make Britain great again.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
But what the sort of flip side of this kind of magical thinking was that for every failure, and there were 4 failures during the course of the 1930s, they would, it would show that the emperor had no clothes.
Yeah, okay. And John Auden and Michael Spender, they had sort of mixed feelings about it, right? They were both patriotic young men. What did they feel about empire? What did they feel about being the colonizers in India? Were they sensitive to it or not?
Well, I think they began by not really thinking about it very much at all. They were very much focused on their work, and for Michael, surveying, for Auden, geology. Auden was very curious about how the Himalayas came to be. This was a time when the idea of continental plates and continental collisions hadn't been universally accepted. So he just was trying to understand what forces could have raised the Himalayas to such a height. He also felt very competitive with Michael Spender because Michael Spender had been invited on an Everest expedition and he had been turned down. So they had this kind of, competition between each other, even though they were on an expedition together and got along perfectly well.
And I was going to ask you and I've forgotten. John Auden, he spent, what, from 1925 to 1953?
Yeah.
And how do you bring Sudhin Datta into your book? Why do you bring him into your book?
Right. Well, my original idea, I have a hard time coming up with book projects because I'm very dependent upon resources like diaries and letters and photographs. But I knew that I wanted to write about Calcutta during the Second World War. And so first I went looking for, since Bengalis are known as writers and intellectuals, I went to look for, archives that would have accounts of letters and things like that. But what I found, because of the surveillance of Indian intellectuals and writers during the Second World War, whatever letters I could find, mostly in the police museum, they didn't really talk much about the war. Partly because I imagine they knew their letters were being intercepted and opened and read. So then I went to the memoirs of the of the 50s and 60s, and of course the memoirs were all about the independence movement, and that was sort of the story that they dominated because that had such a happy ending, and there wasn't really that much written about the war. And in the course of researching this book, very important books on India during the war were published, but when I first started, there wasn't very much. But then when this archivist told me to look at this correspondence between John and W.H. Auden, because John had lived in Calcutta for so many years, I found a letter from Sudhin Datta, who was a poet and intellectual, and various members of the Adda were writing letters to him. And then I found a letter from Michael Spender. So that's how the book sort of began to take shape, was with this circle of friends in Calcutta that John Auden had.
And so John and Sudhin were very good friends, you said?
Yes.
And they used to write to each other?
Yes. There was just this one letter.
Okay.
So, and I had never heard of Sudhindranath Datta, so I began to research about him and, and look for more writings about him. And what I found to anchor the Calcutta sections of the book was, there was a lot about Sudhin's and his Adda, but in the Adda there was a man who kept a diary. And I call him the secret diarist because nobody knew that he'd been keeping a diary, but it was a really amazing and detailed description of their conversations, and also kind of little cartoon drawings of the various characters in the Adda. Unfortunately, the diary, which it was written in English, was lost. But before it was lost, certain sections of it were translated into Bengali and published in a book. So I had those sections translated back into English, and that's the part that I drew on for my Adda sections.
Can you read us a little bit about your Adda section?
Sure.
There are lovely passages describing the Bengali Adda. Just a short portion, please.
Yeah. Okay. I imagine everyone knows what an Adda is, but I'll give a brief description. The Adda was a Calcutta institution. It generally took place at a settled rendezvous at a fixed time. This might be a veranda, a rooftop, an office, or a street corner tea stall. Adda participants could be unemployed graduates or middle-class men with bookish interests. Women and children were scarce. In its purest sense, the Adda was an ongoing conversation among strong, inspiring personalities. Bengalis were less apt to converse than to claim, even on such abstruse subjects as the best bus to take to Baliagata. Ask a Bengali a question and you will get an oration, one Calcutta denizen noted. He sees all the world as a stage on which he has the star role, and even an audience of one is a full house for him. As he gets into his stride, you can see him becoming mesmerized by the stirring cadences of his own eloquence. At the center of an Ada was the Adadari, the sun around which all members orbited. For the Pariche Ada, Sudhinindranath Datta was that sun.
And did John Auden attend these Addas? Did he like them?
He was mentioned showing up at one of the later Addas that happened during the war, but as I say, only parts of the diary exist. But you know, there would be friends of his from Cambridge that were more sort of loyal attendees of the Adda.
What about Tagore? He appears in your book too. Was he? Did he have a direct link with any of your three actors? Or?
Yes. Well, Tagore, as I said, was a contemporary of Sudhin's father, and they were very close. And Sudhin grew up in and out of Tagore's household. And I think Sudhin, especially after this world tour that he did with Tagore, kept Tagore a little bit at arm's length. But towards the end of Tagore's life, Sudhin, you know, put together a special issue Pariche for him and became much more thoughtful about Tagore's role in Bengali letters. But I think he was so much the mountain, you know, everyone felt in his shadow.
Perfect metaphor.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, but you're not telling the best anecdote about Tagore and immigration and the immigrant.
Yes.
Well, tell.
Well, Tagore went on many world tours, and in some countries, someone described him as like, it was like the second coming of Christ. You know, he would be mobbed by people. But apparently on this trip to America with Sudhin, the immigration officer asked him if he could read. And Tagore, of course, was deeply insulted, and he was supposed to be taking a post at UCLA, but he was so disgusted, he basically turned around and went back to Calcutta.
In a week or something,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
This is in 1929, and the immigration officer asks the Nobel Prize laureate if he can read.
Yeah, I think he was trolling.
But her book is just full of jewels like this. I mean, I have to keep thinking, but there are so many lovely anecdotes. Winston Churchill pops in too. Why did you bring Churchill in? Is it because you were thinking about Calcutta during the war and the famine and all that?
Yeah, I mean, Madhusri Mukherjee wrote this amazing book called Churchill's Secret War. It was one of the major resources for me when I was thinking about doing this book. And partly because Churchill is so revered in America, and we had the whole George Bush, Dick Cheney sort of Churchill moment in America, that I felt like really I needed to take Churchill down a peg or two. And because so I weave him throughout the whole book, from 1926, the general strike, to his kind of sabotaging of any constitutional progress being made for India in the 30s, to actually when he's the wartime prime minister, starving Calcutta of the wheat shipments and rice shipments that it needed to survive.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, about his policy during and how it exacerbated the famine or caused it? I'm not sure, but can you talk a little bit about Churchill and the famine?
Yeah, well, basically, Churchill was basically, during the war, Churchill used India as a kind of grand piggy bank. That the agreement was that he could draw on India for all kinds of war material, especially anything for the Eastern Front and soldiers, and that was running up vast sums of money. But the agreement was that England wouldn't have to pay India back until after the war. And Churchill was really used to the idea of India being in debt to England. And so when in 1943, all of a sudden, the sterling balances began being racked up, Churchill began to get quite agitated on the subject of sterling balances and the idea of Great Britain being in actual debt to India. And you had, someone like John Maynard Keynes saying, calm down, we can renegotiate, we can renege, we can, cut down the debt after the war. But, Churchill didn't know what was going to happen, and he could also see the war was, he could see the, light at the end of the tunnel, and the closer the war came to being resolved, he knew that this bill would come due, and at the same time, Calcutta was in a grip of this famine, a famine that hadn't even been declared. And so, Churchill, hated Indians mostly, but in particular he hated Bengalis because the Bengalis had been the most, had been the most violent against British rule. And so he saw this way as a way of sort of punishing them for their subversive, bomb throwing.
Did he specifically talk about Bengalis in a derogatory?
Yeah, he would say the most racist and appalling things about Bengalis.
Like Kipling?
Yes, like Kipling, like Macaulay.
So Sudhin Datta would epitomize the Bengali Babu.
Yes.
What was the Bengali Babu stereotype and how was it created? And how did Sudhin Datta exemplify it in a way?
Well, Sudhin was a deeply cultured man, as deeply read and versed in Bengali literature, in Sanskrit philosophy, as he was in French poetry, in German literature, in American literature, in Freud and Jung and the whole Bloomsbury group. And there was this sense of Bengali Babus as being, sort of hyper-articulate, polysyllabic, they had a great facility for language. And Sudhin felt that, that because, they had absorbed so much Victorian literature that they tended to speak in a way that was a little bit out of fashion.
Right.
It wasn't clipped, English terseness, but a kind of
Flowery.
over the top and flowery. So, I mean, Sudhin's conversation wasn't like that. He chose his words very carefully, but he was quite well aware of what the sort of caricature Bengali Babu was.
And again, from your book, to quote another details about how do you pronounce, Anglophile or Anglophile Bengali houses were and the decor, there were sort of walls of calf-bound books of Tennyson, Dickens, and all the rest. And they even insisted on sometimes on a roast beef with,
Yes,
so from
roast beef and
calf-bound
English
books
mustard. Yeah.
So it was like taken to that extent, this.
Yeah.
So, but there was this tension in Sudhin Datta between loving English literature and hating the colonizer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that he ever really hated England. I think he was very saddened. He was very disappointed, especially as he followed the war in Europe very closely. He kept expecting England to, rush in and save Czechoslovakia, Poland, with soldiers. And when France fell, when Paris fell, he was deeply disappointed. He felt like England wasn't going to do anything, lift a finger to save Europe. It was just going to be all about itself and the empire.
So he felt betrayed.
He felt deeply, deeply betrayed, and he felt into a Great Depression. And he left the Ada to the communists and went to work for Air Raid Precaution.
And when did he die? Much later?
Much later, yeah.
Much later. Michael Spender died. Of the three, who died first? Michael
Spender, yeah. And then Sudhin, and then John Auden.
Then John Auden.
Yeah.
John Auden and Michael Spender loved the same woman, but we're not going to talk about her. But please talk about John Auden's wife and her, who she was. Very interesting.
Yeah, well, in 1938, John Auden traveled to London. He had a furlough. He was there for both the Austrian Anschluss, and he left just as the Munich crisis was being resolved. And during that time, he fell in love with this London painter and introduced her to Michael, and she had to choose between them, and she chose Michael. So he returned to Calcutta quite brokenhearted. And Sudhin, in fact, introduced him to this woman, Sheila Banerjee, who actually Sudhin was having an affair with.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't remember that.
This is my speculation.
Oh, okay.
And also Sudhin was married, and he was afraid of his father's bad opinion, so he eventually introduced Sheila Banerjee to John Auden. Sheila Banerjee was one of five children, 4 girls and 2 boys. That's 6. 6 grandchildren of W.C. Banerjee, who was the first Indian president of the Congress Party. And her father had sort of drank and gambled his way into debt. So the family fortune that her grandfather had established was gone by the time she came of age. So she and her unmarried sisters were looking to get married somehow, you know, when John Auden returned from his furlough, and fell in love with her and married her, you know, within a few months.
Was it a happy marriage? It lasted?
It lasted, but I'm not going to say.
Yeah, and they had 2 daughters.
They had 2
They
daughters.
had 2 daughters.
Yes.
And John Auden's brother wanted to leave his estate to them. He had no children.
Yeah. Yes. W.H. Auden wanted to leave. He was a very fond uncle and adored his nieces, but his boyfriend's stepmother ended up getting all of Auden's estate, so his brother was left without much.
But John Auden was a troubled man. Before he got married, he had a sort of a kind of exciting relationship with women and
A tortured relationship with
talk
women.
about that a little,
course.
because you go into it in the book a little bit.
I think, like for a lot of Englishmen, you know, women were strange and rare creatures. They didn't really understand them very well. John Auden was desperately lonely most of the time, and he had a habit of getting involved with women who were completely inappropriate. He married his psychoanalyst, and that was a very brief marriage. And he just really was no judge of women. Sudan was a much more sensitive and much more appreciative of women than John Auden was. And you know, similar to Michael in that way. Michael really didn't understand, you know, what made anybody tick other than himself. He knew what he was interested in, and he went for it. So I think this was true of a lot of Englishmen. They go to boys' schools, and you know, unless they have sisters, they don't really understand women very well.
And they never climbed Mount Everest, we know that. But what
Yeah.
happened to their great plans to scale Everest?
Well, I thought I would read a little section
Please do.
of, now I've lost it, but of Michael Spender's account. Luckily, Michael kept a expedition journal while he was on Everest. He was brought there to survey the North Face. They only had access to the Everest through Tibet, and there were 2 ways of going up to the summit. You could either go up step 1 or step 2 on a kind of arête, or you could go on the North Face. So the Royal Geographical Society wanted a very detailed map of the North Face of Everest, so that's why Michael was up there. Let's see. That's not it. On half rations for nearly a week, Michael had lost a stone in weight. His constant squitters and increasing weakness were obvious signs of dysentery. The symptoms thus far had been mild, but he had the sense of his gut digesting itself even as he staggered along stony moraines. How would he manage the trek back? He had no idea. But if it meant that he would be returned to his beloved wife intact, he would suffer through whatever pain he had coming to him. Doubtless his wife felt he deserved it. The clear culprit was a tiny piece of 1933 chocolate. This is 1935. They left a lot of rations on the failed 1933 expedition. It had crossed his mind as he accepted it from a Sherpa's none too clean hands that if Chewan had dysentery, he would get it, but he hadn't wanted to hurt his feelings. How ridiculous to take such a risk so as not to hurt a servant's feelings. And now the sampa flour had run out. There was no paraffin to make tea, and still Shipton was the head of the expedition, imagined that he would be able to complete the Nyona Ri survey on the way back. Michael had sent 2 other porters, An Sering and An Tensing, off to Karta Valley with money for food, but they still hadn't returned, and now there was a sea of cumulus over the valley. The chaps had no tents and would have to sleep in the open, in a blizzard. He was racked with worry and stomach cramps. By the end of August, he was sitting out another snowstorm 20,000 feet up Everest. The endless procession of monsoon flurries rendered survey work impossible. When it finally cleared, he could scarcely blame the Sherpas for refusing to continue. Warmer temperatures combined with heavy snowfall made the snowpack unstable and avalanches more likely. Shipton had come to the same conclusion about the advisability of attempting to summit Everest during the monsoon. So yes, the weather was corrupt, beastly. Then the primus died, corrupt. And then they floundered around in snow and fell into thigh-high pools of freezing water en route to Camp 3. The route, too, was pronounced corrupt. So Michael sent Ansering, Nima and Kusang with a rope to Camp 3 to fetch 1933 Danish butter and jam and pemmican and whatever else might be there, while he retreated to Camp 2. While making a cup of Ovaltine, Michael was once more reminded that the shortage of fuel had obliged him to send 3 men over a dangerous route in search of food that didn't need to be heated. Sulking in his tent, he nursed a grievance that dated back to an incident on Mount Kailas when someone took his supply of sugar and Shipton made off with one of his Sherpas. Winter sports in the Alps would never be the same after this, he reflected.
I mean, they faced so much hardship.
Yes, what I like about Michael Spender's journals is like, unlike other sort of mountaineering journals, he was a big complainer. He complained about the food. He complained about the leadership of the expedition. Generally, you know, Englishmen pride themselves on their stiff upper lip. Michael didn't see the point of that. His journals are filled with all kinds of great details about how miserable he and everybody else was. And so I think that's, you know, a fresh look at what really is involved in mountaineering.
And John Auden complained a lot about Calcutta, didn't he? Why?
He did, yes. He found Calcutta, this was before he met Sudan. He found Calcutta very stifling. He was a kind of shy, awkward person. He was very pale skinned, like W.H. Auden, very pale, white hair. And so whenever he got embarrassed, his face would turn bright red, which would, of course, make him even more embarrassed. And his awkwardness just made sort of going to these tea parties and dance parties, and also combined with his arrogance, his intellectual arrogance at the Philistinism of the Calcutta social scene, it was just easier for him to either go to houses of prostitution for company that were much more lighthearted places, or just go off to the mountains and be by himself with his porters.
Why do these young men come to India? What did India mean to them? Why did they choose their careers here?
I think the opportunity in England was really limited, and you know, Auden came from a maybe upper middle class background, but you know, but he had very much a lot of intellectual curiosity, and he was fascinated by geology. He was fascinated by the sort of deep time of geophysics, and India, you know, was sort of this wide open place where he could, you know, he didn't see himself as part of some empire.
No.
He saw himself as just a place where he could go and satisfy his intellectual curiosity.
Make a name for himself? Was this part
Well,
of personal
yes.
glory at
I think
some fundamental level? Was it about greater glory for themselves?
He really, really wanted, his secret dream, and he didn't talk about it with very much, but certainly Wiston knew of it, was to be chosen to climb Everest. But I think partly because he was such an awkward personality, he was never considered sort of a pakasab or, you know, a thruster in the way that, you know, others were. And also they didn't tend to choose men who were based in India for these expeditions.
Okay.
You had to have gone to a certain school, which he did, and you had to have gone to a certain Cambridge or Oxford, which he did, but you had to sort of be circulating in those London Royal Geographical Society circles. And because he was in India, he didn't have access to those social circles.
But he was in India till the 1950s, and then he went back.
What?
John Auden, he was here after independence,
Yes,
and then
he stayed
finally-
through independence and worked very closely with with the Geological Survey of India to help lay the groundwork for the later industrialization of India.
Thank you. Can we take some questions from the audience? Any questions? Yeah, please.
During the course of your research,
Please wait, yeah.
yeah, during the course of your research, did you get a chance to meet with any of their descendants? You said he had 2 daughters, so maybe somebody down the line.
That's a very good question because for me it's really all about sources. Yes, I met his elder daughter. His younger daughter unfortunately died some years ago. So Anita Auden had luckily a lot of his, some had been sold. All of W.H. Auden's letters to John were sold, and that's where I found them in the New York Public Library. But she held on to his journals, all the letters that he exchanged with Sheila Banerjee during the war. They were often separated because Calcutta was, suffered from aerial bombing by the Japanese. She spent a lot of the war in hill stations with the 2 daughters. So they wrote each other, several letters every week. So I was able to, follow their correspondence. And Anita also had photographs, and her mother, Sheila Banerjee, was a painter and had a lot of paintings. And even if you don't end up using that kind of material, it really gives you a sense of their lives. Similarly, with Michael Spender, ended up marrying the painter that both he and John Auden had fallen in love with in 1938. And he had a son who, partly because his father named Philip, and partly because Michael was killed in the last week of the war, and his son grew up without knowing his father at all. Anything to do with Michael's work, and Michael, had worked as a surveyor in the Great Barrier Reef. He'd worked in Greenland as well as in the Himalayas. So his son had a fantastic archive of both his mother, Nancy Sharp, who's the painter we decided not to talk about, and his father's work as a surveyor. And that include hundreds of photographs of the Karakoram and of Everest, and there's even like a little film clip that they discovered, and Michael's maps, which were amazing, amazing works of art.
Any other questions? Tell us about these maps. Why were they like works of art?
Well, one of the things that I learned in the course of researching the book, because I knew it was going to end up in the war, was all the technologies developed to make mountain climbing easier, or like surveying, were repurposed for warfare. So Michael's expertise was in something called the Wild Wield A5, which is this machine that takes 2 photographs, sort of taken from 2 slightly different places on the ground, and they're put together like, one of those Kodachrome things. And when you look at them through a viewfinder, all of a sudden you're looking at an image that's in 3 dimensions. So that helps you draw the topography of a mountain much more easily. And the Swiss had really perfected this when they were remapping all of Switzerland, 2/3 of which are the Alps. So, and then later this was repurposed in wartime with photographic intelligence. So they kept track of what was going on in occupied Europe and where the German armies were and what they were trying to hide by these planes that would fly over and take photographs. So that was sort of the work that Michael did during the war.
Any questions? Yes.
Maybe hello? Yeah, maybe my history is not that good, but the hatred of the Indians by Churchill, what did it actually stem from? How did it actually start?
I don't know. I mean, where does anything come from? I mean, you know, Churchill had a time in India, and he was, you know, off there, participating in these little border skirmishes, and really, he had a much closer, I would imagine, a much closer relationship with the sort of Northwest Territory type warrior races, you know, he called them. And so the Bengalis being more bookish and non-warrior races, you know, and very, you know, articulate, and also had absorbed all these ideas of Hume and Locke, and very great lawyers and solicitors. You know, they had a much greater sense of their own rights and freedoms, and so I think he thought that was uppity on his part. I mean, where does racism come from?
Did he actually think the Indians could never equal them in sort of literature or the way the Bengalis actually are still today? So was it that equalness which developed the hatred?
He would not have accepted that. You know, I mean, this is what I mean about like you know, for him it would be like, what would the imperial crown be without India? You know, I mean, India was so integral to how they thought of themselves as Englishmen. If they didn't have India anymore, they wouldn't really be Englishmen anymore. So it was really the idea of India that was important to them. Not Indians didn't come into it at all. For him. Well, thank you all for coming and listening, and I really appreciate it. And
we had a
I
really
hope to see you
quality
afterwards.
audience.